disrupted. I can only imagine if we had had systems and principles in place coming into COVID, the kind of waste and the kind of incidences for possible collusion or corruption could have been avoided. I want the opportunity to kind of draw out on the recommendations that have been put forward in the white paper, and I want to compare and contrast between your definition of open by default and the government's definition of open by default, which they so proudly place in all the mandate letters. So perhaps Mr. Holman, if you would like to start off with that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great slogan, open by default, isn't it? But the fact of the matter is that open by default has often translated into open except for any material that falls within certain exemptions and exclusions. And as we know, the exemptions and exclusions in the Access to Information Act are quite large. And they have been large, and they have been a problem ever since the Access to Information Act became law. There was a reporter commenting immediately after that law was passed that the loopholes were so big you could fly the Goodyear blimp between them. So what we need to do is we need to establish a law that requires the proactive disclosure of certain broad categories of public records. Enough with giving government an opportunity to exclude certain things. They've proven that they can't be trusted with that. We need a law that actually forces disclosure and forces proactive disclosure of broad categories of information.
Well, I can share with you as a former city councilor, this would be one of the things that I would try to root out in procurement. And we had a heck of a time doing it, particularly as it related to lobbying, and I looked at it as a continuum. And so the contracts are often down the line of the initial engagement on continuum. And I know, I believe it was Mr. Braun who talked about upfront transparency and the idea that some of what we learn about in Canada actually comes from American disclosures. You referenced export records. I'm wondering if anybody would like to speak specifically to the extent to which American lobbying records have far outpaced Canada. And I give reference to, some of the issues around SNC-Lavalin and military contracts and things that Canadian lobbyists had to disclose in the States, but our systems just seem to completely miss.
I can speak to that. So you're absolutely right. And the funny thing is that we actually got an Access to Information Act in the early 80s because there was actually a recognition that in the United States, more information was being made available, information that Canadians didn't have. In fact, one of the big moments was realization that Canadians could get access to information about meat inspection reports at their own meat inspection plants down in the United States, but couldn't get access to those same records in Canada. So we really, I think, need to revisit the amount of comparative information between ourselves and the United States, because it will expose just how secretive our governments in this country are, regardless of their political stripe.
I would tend to agree. There's a certain smugness that we like to do in terms of looking down our noses at America. And, I think that there's a bit of progressivism that happens there in terms of how we're actually treating this information. And, when you look at the contracts, for instance, you wouldn't probably have known this, but this was a question that I brought up repeatedly to the minister responsible for procurement, asking them to post the contracts. My understanding being that it only benefits the seller and not the buyer to have secrecy in these disclosures. And so, again, we heard from Mr. Cutler the idea of, on the vaccines, options versus actuals, right? And so if Mr. Cutler can just speak a little bit about the importance of having an open, government approach to the actual contracts in ways that it might be able to, help us come to a better process, because this isn't about vilifying government. This is about having good processes in place that shine the light in dark corners and make sure that government is actually doing what it says it's doing. So Mr. Cutler, if you'd like to talk about the importance of having details, seeing the devil in the details of our contract.
Yeah, Sean mentioned about the whole concept of openness by default, okay? I would tend to state that the government for many years has been openness by exception, not by default. And our premise, or my premise, would be from a user's viewpoint, from a public viewpoint, openness by exception. You can only close it down occasionally. And these contracts, by the way, what I was talking about are the normal process that is already there. I'm not talking about something that's new. I want a copy of a contract. I make an access request. I get a copy of the contract. I have seen the contract for Phoenix, for example. It has been given to me by the media who was given it. So the only thing that was missing was certain redacted portions, but it was enough to tell me a lot of the problems. So every contract put out under the COVID situation could be published. We then would know who it was, how much money we're spending in total. We don't need the individual figures for a firm, but how much in total, the details of the contract, all that information is already what is normally given.
I'd love to see those numbers on Deloitte myself. I know I'm at the end of time, so.
Yeah, I'm not asking for anything new.
The medical officer was asked if she ever advised the Liberals that the emergency stockpile was underfunded. But the health minister prevented Dr. Tam from answering the question. She claimed it was cabinet confidence.